Do you want to know one of the reasons why you shouldn't buy a 3D printer? It's because you're not going to end up with just one 3D printer. Let's see how this fits. Oh. I remember my good friend Oscar telling me a decade ago that I should buy a 3D printer and jump into the entire creational process. But back then, 3D printing was kind of this tinkering thing that you need to spend a lot of time on to get it to work the way that you want it to work. And you actually needed to learn how to design stuff because there wasn't a lot of things that you could download from the internet that was high quality. So at that time, it kind of felt too technical for me to jump into 3D printing and 3D design. But then we fast forward to today, and the great thing with 3D printers is that they work pretty much straight out of the box. Say for example, this 3D printer, which is the Bambolab H2D. Fantastic machine that not only can 3D print, but it can also laser engrave stuff. You just replace the actual head with this, and then you can customize your own things. You can cut some wood or cut some acrylic or whatever you want to do. This can do it. And that is why you see that the glass is green here, because if you're lasering some stuff, you need to have protection for your eyes when you're actually looking at the laser. And this kind of green glass is protecting you from the radiation to hit your eyes. But I've been so incredibly satisfied with this 3D printer and how it works that I've actually gotten a new one without the laser engraving function, but it's still a Bambolab H2D. And one of the reasons why I went for the Bambolab printer to begin with was because I was reading up online on how simple they actually were to use and that they're pretty much plug and play. And that is actually how simple it is to get started with a 3D printer. Now you have a bunch of different materials that you can use, but the one that I recommend to any beginner when you're starting out with 3D printer is called PLA, which stands for polylactic acid. And it's basically a plastic that is biodegradable and is very easy to print with, which makes it very simple to get started with. And they also have a platform that's called Maker World, which I upload stuff to, and you can upload stuff to. And anyone that is actually creating 3D printing files can upload to Maker World and create their own profiles so that people can go there and follow and download and support the people that are creating the prints. It's basically like a social media platform, but for 3D printing enthusiasts. And downloading prints to your printer that other people has created is, in my opinion, a very good start, because it's kind of the same thing when you buy your first camera. You don't go out to shoot like the biggest cinematic hit film in history. You start out by practicing and you learn and you watch other people do things and then you copy that. And the same kind of process should be applied to 3D printers. And here's also why I think everyone should give it a try that has a little bit of interest for it. It is an amazing way to be able to bridge the gap between the digital world and the actual physical world. And when you buy your first 3D printer, you will start to think like, why does this not exist? And then you start to think like, hey, can I actually design this on my own? And that is where you start to learn how things actually work. So maybe you go out and you buy a caliper in order to be able to get the measurements of something that you are using on a daily basis. And then you start to pay attention to the layer direction that things are printed in, or maybe you start to understand the infill of the things that you downloaded from Maker World and why it didn't hold up the way that you thought it would. And then eventually you're going to try different materials to see which one is more durable and why it works for you and why it doesn't work for you and what happens if you print it too thin or if you print it too thick. You kind of start to get a better understanding of how the actual real world works and the products that we have in it. Like all the different things that are made is basically designed in CAD, and everything that you see here behind me is designed in CAD. And I remember with that kind of locked in my head, and I started to think like, hey, you know what? Everything that I see in my entire studio is made in CAD. So jumping into 3D printing for me has definitely been one of the reasons of me being where I am today. One of the first things that I actually started to design with a 3D printer was this. And some of you might have seen it, but it's basically a battery holster where you can fit 3 different batteries into, and I wanted to have something like this in my camera bag, but I did not know how to design it. So I sat down with a caliper, took all the measurements on the batteries, and then tried my best to design some sort of holster in Tinkercad. And when you start to design stuff, you're gonna do prototypes after prototypes after prototypes. Like I have an entire box in my old studio with prototypes off the TriCharge. But eventually, when I was feeling satisfied with the actual product, I reached out to a brand and asked them to create this, which is an actual physical product that is based on the design that I made with my 3D printer. It's definitely helped me to unlock my creativity in a way that I didn't think would be possible before I started to do 3D printing. And it doesn't have to be complicated, because the simplest things are usually the best solutions. I mean, this is not a complicated design. It just solved the problem that I had. And if I experience something that I have a problem with, then there's probably hundreds or thousands of people out there having the same exact problem. And over the years, I've been designing multiple different things to enhance my studio and make it better in the ways that I think is needed whenever I work here. And one of those things that I made is something that I call the Exo boxes. It's basically this small tiny box that is a storage compartment that you can attach to the IKEA Skådis that you can see right here. It's a very simple construction, but it's also making this entire wall into a storage solution that I didn't have before I started to do 3D printing. And to be able to actually find solutions to the problems that arises around your studio with a 3D printer is incredibly satisfying. I think one of the biggest challenges to actually get started with 3D printing is knowing what kind of 3D printer that you should buy. And this one that I got right here is like $1,700, and it's not something that you need to buy in order to get started. There's a couple of things that I think is very important with a 3D printer that you should think of though. And the first thing that you should think of is to buy a printer that is reliable. I have well over 5,000 hours with all my 3D printers combined from Bambu Lab, and I have had 0 breakdowns. And I think that that is a very good indication of where the quality actually lies with the 3D printers that Bambu Lab makes, but also how much you can actually print with the printer just from the start. And it's also very important that you don't overwhelm yourself. And by saying that, I mean that you should not jump in thinking that you're gonna be able to design everything when you start out. And that's why I mentioned Maker World previously in the video, because I think it's so freaking cool that you can download my print and then you can print it on your own printer and actually learn how the layer processing works and how the infill process works, what a brim is, and all the things that is kind of tied to 3D printing when it comes to using the actual slicer. And for those of you that don't know what the slicer is, it's actually the program that you upload your 3D model to, and then it slices down the entire model into different layers with different kind of infills, and you can control how it's going to be oriented on the actual plate when you're printing it. And one of the most satisfying prints is the prints that you can print without supports that are still incredibly sturdy. But breaking prints is actually a part of the process, because that is how we learn what works and what doesn't work. So if you have the money, then absolutely go for one of the printers like this, because it's not a bad beginner printer and it's a freaking amazing printer to develop in. But if you are a little bit scarce on money and you want to have something that is a little bit cheaper and you want to jump into the process without spending a fortune, then this is what you should get. This right here is the Bambu Lab A1. And I've actually made a video covering my thoughts and opinions on it and why I think it's a great printer for anyone that is starting out with 3D printing. Now, it's not an enclosed 3D printer, which means that I don't recommend you to print heavy-duty materials such as ASA or PA or stuff like that. I don't even think you can print PA, which is nylon, on the printer like this. But it is very capable of printing in PLA and PETG, and it's a great piece of tech to actually get started. And if you're anything like me, then eventually you will get addicted to it, because you're going to jump down a rabbit hole that has absolutely no end to it. And the moment you open Fusion and start to learn how the principles work in that program, and you can actually design something of your own, you're going to be spending so many hours in here. I've been spending multiple days, weeks, months even, designing specific things. The addictive part doesn't come from actually designing things in Fusion, even though it's nice, but it's actually about the problem solving. So what I got right here is a mount for my Zonos 1 so that I could put it on my IKEA Skådis. And I think that I spent around 4 days designing this print from scratch to finish. And you kind of get caught up with all the design features such as chamfers, fillets, and all that stuff that you will learn eventually. And this right here is actually one of my first designs, which was when I moved into the studio and I wanted to have a place for my AC remote. That's kind of sick. And then I did the same thing for the TV remote so that it also has a place. Oh, and these Nerf gun holders, also 3D printed and designed. And the Sonos beam that you can see up here, that mount, also 3D printed and designed by me. And the same thing goes for these mug holders, which is also designed and printed by yours truly. And this is also something that I designed and printed to be able to mount all my flashlights and my knives onto the IKEA Skådis as well. I also designed this, which allows you to put a tripod ball head onto the actual 3D print so that it's sturdy enough to be able to keep your camera on your IKEA Skådis. And the cool thing is that if you want to replace this and move it, you can just do that and put it back wherever you want it to be because it's sturdy enough to keep the entire camera up. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, my latest addition to the studio is actually these, which I call the Exo boxes. Designing 3D prints requires a lot of experimentation and testing different materials. And talking about materials, we have a bunch of different ones that you can use for a bunch of different things. You have TPU, which is a very flexible plastic, so you can bend it, you can flip it, you can turn it, you can use it as sealant. There's a bunch of different use cases for TPU, and they have PLA as we touched on previously, but there's also PETG, which is actually the same kind of material that is made in PET bottles. And I do think that PETG is probably the best all-around material that you can use for pretty much anything without having to worry about UV lighting or something degrading in water and so on and so forth. And they have ABS, which is also a very hard plastic, but you also have ASA, which is a very chemical resistant plastic, but it also smells a whole lot when you're printing. So you gotta make sure that you have a ventilated area or that you have an exhaust that actually pulls out the fumes that comes from printing something like ASA. And they also have something that is called PA, which stands for nylon. And this case that I designed and printed for my phone is actually carbon fiber reinforced nylon. I printed this case 6 months ago and it has been performing flawlessly ever since. Like, I've dropped it and I've dented it, but you can barely see any sort of scratches. And it doesn't really matter what kind of material that you print, there will always be some visible layer lines when you are 3D printing stuff. I guess we can say that you're going through a bunch of different phases when you're buying a 3D printer, which I think is good because you shouldn't start at the top and then work your way down. It should be the opposite way. But ultimately, the more you learn about 3D design and 3D printing, the more you understand that it's about engineering and actually creating stuff from the ground up. And I think that one of the absolute best parts when it comes to 3D printing is that it removes the friction of things. It creates solutions. And whenever there's something that solves a problem in my workflow and removes friction from me creating stuff, then I basically double down on that and try to streamline everything I can within the field that I'm in. And I've talked about this before, how I like the process of creating so much, but I still think that that is one of the main aspects as to why I'm so interested in 3D printing and the creational process right now. Because I want to spend more time building stuff rather than consuming stuff. And I want to spend more time creating stuff rather than consuming stuff. I guess we can call it skill stacking because I want to learn as many things as I possibly can within the fields that I'm in. I've learned how to use a camera. I've learned how to do the editing. I've learned how to actually build a freaking wooden deck and to build a freaking pool and to build my own studio with my own 2 hands. So if you're the type of person that wants to understand how things work and wants to create your own things or empower yourself to actually be a part of the creation process, then you're gonna love a 3D printer. Trust me on that. So I really hope that you liked this video, and if you did, please do give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to pick up some merch if you want to do that. And don't forget to pick up my LUTs as well, because those are what I use to grade this entire video and all the B-roll and everything, basically. If you're shooting Sony cameras. There will be iPhone LUTs coming soon, so stay tuned for that. But yeah, hope you liked the video, and thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one. Peter from Sweden is saying goodbye.